The letter arrived on a Thursday. I know because I remember the light low, early October, coming through the sacristy window at an angle that turned the brass holy water font by the door into something almost luminous. The woman who handed it to me had driven 4 hours to give it to me in person. She did not trust the mail. She did not trust much of anything anymore. She had written 14 pages by hand. The handwriting started neat and deteriorated by page 3. She was asking a question that she had been afraid to ask her own pastor, because she suspected he would tell her that her mother was simply gone, that death was the end of the conversation, that what she was feeling was grief and not obligation. She wanted to know if there's anything she could do, not for herself, for her mother. She had been present at her mother's deathbed. She had watched a woman who had practiced the faith for 60 years, who had prayed her rosary every morning before sunrise, who had received the sacraments with what appeared to be genuine contrition, die with a level of agitation that her daughter could not account for. Not physical agitation from the illness, though that was present. Something else, something in the eyes in the last hours, something that made the daughter say to me, after 14 pages of careful, controlled writing in the last paragraph, that she was afraid her mother might not be all right. And then she asked whether she could do anything about it now. That is the question. Not the polite version of it, not the version sanitized for comfortable homilies, the real version. The version that assumes something is actually happening somewhere, that death is not a wall but a threshold, that the relationship between the living and the dead is not metaphorical but real, and that what we do here matters to what is happening there. That question. I have been a priest for many decades. I have sat with the dying and with those left behind. I have read Thomas Aquinas on the souls separated from their bodies in the state of purification, what the scholastics describe with precision as the condition of a soul that died in sanctifying grace but with temporal punishment, still owed. I have read the definitions of the Council of Florence 1439 and the Council of Trent 1563 on this matter. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the question this woman was asking is one that the Church has a real answer to, not a consoling fiction. A real answer with real theology behind it and real practices attached to it. But I can also tell you that the real answer requires a certain... For 400 years, the Church provided the laity with specific prayers to address situations in their homes that they could not explain. Most parishes stopped teaching them after 1965. Now, they have all been compiled into a concise, practical guide. Keep it near the door and read the first page tonight. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first pinned comment. Precision in the telling. Because the enemy of souls who operates, as I have seen over decades in this ministry, with an intelligence Aquinas described in the Summa Theologica, the prima pars, questions 50 through 64, as exceeding human understanding in scope and speed, that enemy is not the only one capable of distortion. We are also capable of it. We distort in the direction of false comfort. We promise what we cannot promise. And in promising what we cannot promise, we sometimes give people something that looks like hope but functions as a substitute for the hard work the Church actually prescribes. So let me tell you what I told her. I will not give details that would identify this woman or her mother. What I will give you is a composite of what I have encountered across many years and many conversations, the pattern, the doctrine, and the practice. Because the pattern is consistent enough to teach from, and the doctrine is precise enough to stand on. I am Father Chad Ripperger. I am a Thomistic philosopher and one of a small number of priests still authorized and trained to perform solemn exorcisms in the Church. I am a member of the Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother. This is not the ministry I would have chosen. I say that without drama. I say it because it bears on what follows. A man who chose this would approach it differently than a man who was assigned to it. I observe what I observe because I have to. I report what the Church has always taught because that is what the evidence, as I have encountered it across decades, consistently points toward. She and I sat down in the parlor adjacent to the sacristy The October light had moved by then, and the brass font was back to being just a font. She had the 14 pages folded in her hands. I asked her to tell me in her own words what she had seen, not what was written. Her mother had been ill for 8 months with an illness that was both physical and, toward the end, something harder to categorize. She had received last rites, the anointing of the sick, administered by a priest who, the daughter told me carefully, had done it properly. The rosary beads had been in her mother's hands. The brown scapula she had worn for 40 years was around her neck. And yet, in the final 24 hours, the agitation had increased rather than decreased. The daughter described it with the precision of someone who had been running the scene back for weeks. Her mother's eyes would settle for a moment and then shift, not to the corner of the room in the way the dying sometimes do, that particular quiet of someone who was already partly somewhere else, but with something that looked more like argument, like there was a negotiation happening that had not been resolved. I asked the daughter whether her mother had been to confession recently before the final illness began. She said yes. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote more than a dozen questions on how fallen angels operate. Most Catholics have never read one line of it. This archive gathers that teaching, the 1,614 rite, and 4 centuries of documented cases into a single reference. Read it slowly, 1 chapter a night. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first posted comment. Yes, within the last few months. I asked whether there had been any involvement in her mother's life at any point with occult practices, horoscopes, Ouija boards, anything of that family. The daughter thought for a moment and said her mother had, decades earlier, gone through a period, she used the phrase, a dark time, when she had consulted a psychic regularly. She said her mother had confessed it years later and considered it closed. She said it defensively because she could sense where the question was going. I am not surprised by this pattern. I have seen it many times across the course of this ministry. What appears on the surface to be a devout Catholic life, daily rosary, brown scapular, regular masses, genuine piety can coexist with a wound in the spiritual history that was confessed but perhaps not fully understood in its weight at the time of confession. This is not a criticism of the confessor or of the penitent. Confession remits the guilt of sin, the temporal punishment that sin leaves behind, and in some cases the disordered spiritual attachment that sin created even after the guilt is gone. Those require something more. They require penance, mortification, the sustained practice of the contrary virtue, and in some cases intercession after death if the work was not finished in life. The daughter told me something else that I had not asked about yet. Her mother had been under what the family described as considerable spiritual distress in the last several months of her life. Not depression in the clinical sense, she had been evaluated for that, and the physicians had found nothing definitive, something more like a pressing weight, a sense that something remained unfinished. The daughter said her mother had mentioned to her in one of their last coherent conversations a name, a person she had wronged decades earlier, a financial matter, small in the scope of what money can measure, but the kind of thing that sits at the bottom of a conscience and does not leave. The daughter was not certain whether her mother had ever made it right. I told her that this was worth praying into specifically. When a soul carries an unresolved obligation of justice, a debt unpaid, a wrong unaddressed, the temporal dimension of that can persist. Not because God is mechanical or because heaven operates on an accounting ledger in the way we imagine, but because the soul's own attachment to the unresolved matter participates in the purification. The soul in purgatory, the tradition teaches, desires this purification even as it is painful. It sees clearly in the light of God everything it could not see clearly in life. And it longs for the completion. I told her that if she could make restitution on her mother's behalf, identify the person wronged, if possible, and make it right, this was an act that would have real spiritual significance for her mother's soul. She looked at the table for a long moment. She said she thought she knew who it was. She was not sure how to find them after so many years. I told her that was her work to do, and that her mother's soul was waiting for her to do it. I told her I was not implying her mother was damned. That needs to be stated clearly before we can proceed. I told her that the church teaches and has always taught that souls in purgatory are absolutely certain of their salvation. The uncertainty is not about whether they reach God, but about the duration of the purification. The fear some people carry that a soul might be lost because they died with something unresolved, that fear, while it can reflect genuine charity, is often inaccurate. If a person died in a state of sanctifying grace, even with faults, even with imperfectly resolved wounds in their spiritual history, they are in the hands of a mercy that no earthly judgment can measure. But that mercy does not mean the purification is instantaneous. It does not mean there is nothing left to be worked through. And this is where the Church's teaching on purgatory becomes not a pious abstraction, but a real doctrine with real consequences for how we pray. Aquinas in the Summa draws a careful distinction between the guilt of sin, which is remitted in confession, and the temporal punishment that remains after the guilt is remitted. Think of it this way. A man breaks a window, he apologizes, the owner forgives him, the relationship is restored. But the window is still broken. Something still has to be done about the window. The temporal punishment attached to sin is the broken window. Confession and absolution restore the relationship, but the temporal punishment may remain. In this life, it is discharged through acts of penance, through indulgences applied to oneself, through suffering united to Christ. In the next life, if it was not discharged here, it is purified there. The soul in purgatory cannot merit. It cannot act on its own behalf. It is no longer in the state of wayfaring. It cannot make new choices, cannot offer new prayers, cannot apply new indulgences to itself. It is dependent. This is the part that stops people. We live in a culture that has made self-sufficiency into something approaching a moral virtue, and the image of a soul that is entirely dependent on the charity of others cuts against that instinct in a painful way. But the Church's tradition is clear. The souls in purgatory are members of the Church. Not the Church militant, which is us, but the Church suffering. They are still in communion with us. And the communion of saints is not a metaphor. It is a real participation in one another's spiritual good. This is what the daughter was sensing, without having the theological vocabulary for it. She was sensing the real thing. She was right that the conversation was not over. She was right that her mother was still in some way reachable. And she was right that she could do something. The question is what exactly and how precisely to understand what it accomplishes. Before I answer that, I want to acknowledge something. There is a version of this teaching that circulates on the internet that I find genuinely problematic. The version that implies that if you pray a specific novena on a specific day or perform a particular devotion with sufficient feeling, you will receive an inner assurance that the person has been released, that your peace of mind is confirmation of their deliverance. I have heard this described as spiritual consolation. It is not. It is sentimentalism dressed in theological language. The Church has never taught that the subjective peace of the living is evidence of the state of the dead. And the preachers who offer that kind of comfort are not being kind. They are being irresponsible. They are depriving people of the serious, sustained, doctrinally grounded practice that actually helps in exchange for a feeling that costs nothing and obligates nothing. I am not going to tell you that if you perform a certain set of prayers before nightfall on a specific day, your mother will leave purgatory that afternoon. That is not what the Church teaches, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either ignorant of the tradition or is telling you what you want to hear. What I am going to tell you is that the Church has, in her wisdom, identified certain spiritual acts as especially powerful in aiding the souls in purgatory, acts that God, in His mercy, permits to benefit the dead through the living, and that these acts are real, that their efficacy is not in question, that the only uncertainty is the application, and that the application belongs to God alone. Here is what I told her, and what I have taught for years to anyone who asks this question seriously. The most powerful offering you can make for a specific departed soul is the Holy Mass. This is not a pious opinion. This is the consistent teaching of the Church across centuries. The Mass is the unbloody representation of the one sacrifice of Calvary. Its value is infinite. When a Mass is offered for a specific intention, for a specific soul, named in the intention, the Church teaches that this is the highest possible application of the Church's treasury of merit. The Curé d'Ars, Jean-Marie Vianney, who died on the 4th of August, 1859 in the village of Ars-sur-Formans in eastern France, and who is one of the greatest parish priests the Church has ever produced, spoke about this with an intensity that embarrassed some of his contemporaries. He said that we do not know the worth of the Mass for the dead, that we would go to Mass every hour if we really understood what we were doing for those souls. Have a Mass offered for your mother's soul, one Mass. If you can, have more than one. If you can have 30 consecutive Masses offered for the same soul, you are following a tradition called Gregorian Masses, so named because the practice is attributed in its developed form to Pope Saint. Gregory the Great, who recorded in his dialogues a case in which a monk named Justus, who had died with an attachment to hidden money, was released from his purification after 30 consecutive Masses were offered for him specifically. The tradition is 14 centuries old. The Church has consistently approved it and authorized the faithful to seek it. It is not magic and it is not commerce. It is the application, through the ordained priest, of the highest act of worship in an extended and concentrated manner for the benefit of a specific soul. She had a notebook out by now. She wrote down Gregorian Masses. She had never heard the term. Indulgences are the second great tool. A plenary indulgence, one that, when the conditions are met, remits all temporal punishment due to sin, can be applied to a deceased soul by way of suffrage. That phrase, per modum suffragii, is essential. It means that we offer it and God decides how it is applied. We do not control the outcome. We offer it in hope, in charity, with trust that God will apply what we offer to the soul for whom we offer it. The conditions for a plenary indulgence, as defined in the Enchiridion Indulgentiarum, sacramental confession within 20 days, reception of Holy Communion, prayer for the intentions of the Holy Father, and a complete freedom from attachment to even venial sin. When all those conditions are met, and the indulgence is gained and offered for a specific departed soul, the Church teaches that it is applied by God's mercy to that soul. The daughter asked whether her mother's soul would receive it immediately. I said, that is not within our knowledge. The application is God's. What is within our knowledge is that the act of charity is real, the offering is real, and the mercy of God is real. We do what is ours to do, and we trust what is His to His hands. This is not resignation. This is the correct posture of a creature before its Creator. The Rosary. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, who bore the 5 wounds of Christ on his body, the stigmata, from the 20th of September 1918 until his death 50 years later, described the Rosary as a weapon. He was not speaking metaphorically. He used that word because he understood the Rosary as a specific, structured act of prayer linked to the mysteries of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, and therefore as something the enemy of souls has reason to resist. The Rosary offered for a specific departed soul, with the intention stated and the offering directed, is part of the Church's ancient practice of praying for the dead. Almsgiving. The tradition goes back to the Old Testament. Tobit, chapter 12, verse 9, states that alms purge away sin. The Church has always connected the giving of material goods for the poor to the benefit of souls in purgatory. This is not superstition. It is the logic of the communion of saints, an act of genuine charity offered in union with the sacrifice of Christ, participates in that sacrifice in a way that the Church teaches benefits not only the giver, but the soul for whom the gift is directed. The heroic act of charity is less widely known. It is a voluntary act by which a Christian offers all the satisfactory works he performs in his lifetime and all the indulgences he gains, as well as all prayers offered for him after his death, for the benefit of the souls in purgatory to be applied by Our Lady as she sees fit, rather than being reserved for himself. It is not binding under pain of sin. It is an act of pure charity. Those who make it are sometimes called faithful clients of Our Lady of Purgatory. The Church has approved this act for centuries. It is found in the traditions of the Carmelites and in the writings of those who taught the spiritual life before the 20th century had finished emptying the theological libraries. I told the daughter all of this over the course of perhaps an hour and a half. By the end, the 14 pages were back in her bag, and the notebook had several pages of its own. She asked me one more question before she left. She asked, "Is there any way to know that my mother has been released? Any sign? Any confirmation?" I told her, honestly, that the answer the church gives is no. We do not, in this life, receive verified information about the status of specific souls in purgatory. There are accounts in the lives of the saints of communications from the dead saint. John Vianney reported that Le Grappin, as he called the devil in the dialect of his region, would torment him at night, and he also reported consolations from souls in purgatory for whom his masses had helped. But these are private revelations at best, and private revelations do not constitute the kind of doctrinal certainty that obligates the faithful to believe them. What she could know was this: she had done her part. That is within her competence. God's part is God's. Now I want to return briefly to the daughter and what happened next in our conversation. After she had written down everything I had told her about the Mass and indulgences and the Rosary, she asked me a question that I think many people would ask if they felt free to. She said, "Father, do you think there is something interfering with my mother? Not just natural suffering, something more." I told her that I did not know. I said that carefully because in this ministry, one of the things you learn is that the urge to explain ambiguous spiritual phenomena by appeal to the demonic is itself a temptation. The temptation toward a dramatic narrative that makes you feel you are dealing with something special and terrible rather than the ordinary quiet work of purification. I have seen cases where the spiritual distress at a deathbed was exactly what it appeared to be: the soul of a sinner who loved God, confronting the weight of a lifetime in the full clarity of dying, and needing the church's prayers. Nothing more, nothing less. And that nothing less is an immense thing. What I told her was this: the question of whether something demonic had complicated her mother's spiritual history was not one she needed to resolve in order to act rightly. The actions I was describing to her, the Mass, the indulgences, the Rosary, the alms, the restitution, these were the church's prescription for every soul in need of suffrages. They did not require a diagnosis. They required charity and fidelity. And charity and fidelity were what she had driven 4 hours to offer. Now, for you, listening to this, you may be in the same position as that woman. You may have buried someone recently. You may have buried someone years ago, and the question is never fully settled. You may be thinking of a parent, a spouse, a child, a friend who was not by any measure a saint in the conventional sense, who struggled, who had unresolved things, who died in a condition you were not sure how to characterize. The church teaches that if they died with any degree of contrition, with the smallest genuine turning toward God in their final moments, the mercy available to them is real. Your job is not to adjudicate their condition. Your job is to pray for them as if it matters. Because it does matter. This is the testimony of the tradition. This is what Aquinas built into his account of the church as a communion across the three states: the triumphant in heaven, the suffering in purgatory, the militant on earth. We are in real contact. The acts of charity we perform for the dead are not gestures. They are real transfers of spiritual good, mediated through the sacrifice of Christ and applied by the justice and mercy of God. But I need to say something else, because this is where the institutional collapse of the last several decades has done particular harm. The Catholic faithful in the second half of the 20th century were, in enormous numbers, never taught any of this. The catechesis that should have formed them in the doctrine of purgatory, in the power of indulgences, in the tradition of Gregorian masses, in the heroic act of charity, was replaced in most parishes and most Catholic schools with a formation so diffuse that it communicated almost nothing with content. The generation that came of age after Vatican II, which closed in 1965, was largely trained on an approach to religious education that was heavy on experience and extraordinarily light on doctrine. I am not telling you the council itself mandated this. I am telling you that the implementation in most of the English-speaking West produced Catholics who reached adulthood genuinely unaware that their prayers for the dead were not merely sentimental, but were structurally effective acts in a real communion. The result is that people who lose someone they love default to the consolation that the person is simply in a better place, full stop, and they feel obscurely that praying for that person would be an insult, as if they were implying the person needed help. They have confused the certainty of salvation with the completeness of purification. These are not the same thing. The greatest saints sought purification of their own volition. Purgatory is not a punishment track for second-rate Catholics. It is the completion of what the sacrament of confession initiates and what death does not automatically finalize. The collapse of confession has made this worse. When people do not go to confession regularly, and the data on this, as I have taught for years, is stark. Confession lines in the 1950s stretched around city blocks, and now many parishes report no one in the confessional at all on Saturday afternoons. They do not have a lived, practical understanding of what it means to address temporal punishment. Confession becomes, in their imagination, something you do when things are very bad, rather than the ordinary maintenance of a spiritual condition that is always, to some degree, in need of repair. You can object that I am being harsh about this. I would ask you to consider what the alternative is. The alternative is to continue to give people a therapeutic version of the faith that tells them everything is fine and leaves them without tools. I have watched that play out across decades. I find it considerably harsher than the truth. The Real Presence survey data published in the last decade showed that a majority of self-identified Catholics did not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. If that is where we are, then the root problem is not that people lack information about Gregorian Masses. The root problem is that the Eucharist has been functionally demoted from the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ to a community symbol. And if the Eucharist is merely a symbol, then the Mass is merely a gathering. And if the Mass is merely a gathering, then offering 30 consecutive Masses for your departed mother's soul is just going to 30 consecutive gatherings, which is a generous thing to do but has no particular efficacy. The whole machinery of what I have described to you depends on the doctrine behind it being intact. This is what the enemy of souls has understood for centuries and what we have been slow to grasp. The way to render a Catholic population spiritually defenseless is not to attack it with visible force. The more efficient route is to hollow out its categories, to leave the words in place while emptying out the reference, so that people continue to say the Eucharist and Mass and confession and indulgence while meaning by those words something functionally inert. You are right if you feel something wrong in this. You are right that something has been taken. I am not able to tell you precisely what God will do with this. I am not able to tell you that the post-conciliar confusion will be resolved in a particular way or on a particular timeline. What I can tell you is that the Church has survived worse. And she has survived it because there have always been people who refused to accept the hollow version, who learned the real doctrine, who practiced the real sacraments, who kept going to confession, who kept the rosary in their hands, who understood the Mass for what it is. Here is what this week looks like if you take this seriously. Go to confession. This week, not in 3 weeks when it is convenient, this week. The confessional is the place where temporal punishment is addressed in this life, where the legal ground of the enemy is closed, where the separation that sin creates between you and the grace you need to help your departed loved ones is closed. Find a sound priest and go. If your parish does not offer regular confession times, call ahead and make an appointment. Do not accept the version of Catholicism that tells you confession is optional. Receive the Eucharist worthily. That means receiving in the state of grace. That means having gone to confession if you are aware of mortal sin. The Eucharist received in the state of grace is not just a spiritual comfort, it is the real presence of Christ. And in receiving it with proper intention and offering it for a specific soul, you are performing an act of worship that the entire tradition of the Church identifies as powerful beyond what we can measure. Have a Mass offered for the specific soul you are praying for. Go to a priest, give a Mass stipend, give a name, and ask for a Mass for that person's soul. If you can find a monastery or a priestly society that offers Gregorian masses, have that conversation. The tradition is specific and the practice is active. There are communities in this country and in Europe that still do this and will accept intentions. Gain a plenary indulgence and apply it to your departed loved one. Learn the conditions, fulfill them exactly. It is not difficult. It requires what